I don't believe in God anymore. Not after what I witnessed at St. Ecclesia Obscura. But I believe in something now. Entities that hover in sacred spaces, waiting in the silence between whispered devotions. They listen. They answer. And answers come with a terrible price. Let me tell you about the church where I worked, where shadows moved against the light and prayers hung in the air like poison. But first, I must give you the same warning I received, scrawled on yellowed parchment my first day. If you hear whispered prayers from the confession booth, but no one is inside, walk away. Some prayers are in languages you will not recognize. Do not try to understand them. If you ever hear someone praying for you by name, leave immediately. They are not praying for your salvation. I should have heeded these warnings. I should have walked away the moment Father Thaddeus slid that parchment across his ancient desk. His smile, never-reaching eyes so pale. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But desperation makes fools of the faithful and the faithless alike. I had nowhere else to go when I found the listing. Caretaker needed. St. Ecclesia Obscura. Room and board provided. Seminary experience preferred. The seminary part caught my attention. I'd been 3 months from ordination when I lost my faith, watching my sister waste away from cancer, despite endless prayers that echoed hollowly against hospital walls. The rain was relentless the day I arrived. Water streaming from gargoyles' mouths along the church's Gothic facade. St. Ecclesia Obscura loomed against the gray sky, its stone blackened with age, its spire disappearing into low-hanging clouds. The building seemed to breathe in the downpour, expanding and contracting in my peripheral vision. Father Thaddeus met me at the heavy oak doors, his cassock immaculate despite the weather. Aga had carved deep lines into his face, yet his movements possessed uncanny fluidity. His handshake felt like gripping sun-warmed stone. "Michael Hayes," he said, my name emerging as if tasted rather than spoken. "You've come at an auspicious time." Our last caretaker departed, unexpectedly. The church interior smelled of ancient incense, candle wax, and something metallic beneath, like old pennies or blood. Rows of pews stretched toward an altar, carved from black marble, where a silver crucifix hung suspended by chains that vanished into the shadows of a ceiling too high to properly discern. "The duties are simple," Father Thaddeus explained, leading me through the nave. "Maintain the grounds, assist with services, record prayer requests, staff the night hours when parishioners seek solace." His voice echoed strangely in the space, as if the acoustics defied natural laws. When he spoke of prayer requests, the echo lingered several seconds too long. "You'll have private quarters in the east transept. The pay is modest, but few inquire about that. Most come for answers." "Answers to what?" I asked. Father Thaddeus smiled again, revealing teeth too small and numerous for a human mouth. "That depends entirely on their questions, doesn't it?" In his office, a cramped space behind the sacristy, he slid the yellowed parchment across his desk. The rules were written in meticulous calligraphy, the ink brown rather than black. "These must be observed without exception," he said. "Your predecessor failed in this regard." "What happened to him?" I asked, scanning the cryptic warnings. Father Thaddeus's expression remained fixed. His prayers were answered. Before I could ask what that meant, a sound drifted from the main chamber. Soft, broken sobbing that raised goosebumps along my arms. Father Thaddeus seemed not to notice. "That will be all for today," he said, rising. "Sister Helena, we'll show you to your quarters. Services begin at dawn." I followed the sound of weeping instead, drawn to its raw desperation. The church seemed larger inside than its exterior suggested, shadows pooling in corners that shouldn't exist. The sobbing led me to the confession booth, an ornate wooden structure with intricate carvings of angels, whose expressions resembled agony more than rapture. When I pulled back the heavy curtain, I found the booth empty, yet the sobbing continued for 3 more seconds before abruptly cutting off, leaving behind a silence so profound my ears rang with it. That night, in my sparse quarters, I dreamed of the confession booth. In the dream, I sat inside while countless whispered prayers filtered through the screen, gradually rising in volume until they became a roar of supplication that filled my mouth and lungs like water. I woke gasping, my pillow wet with what I thought was sweat, until I switched on the lamp and saw the rusty stain. Sister Helena arrived at my door precisely at dawn. She was slight, her habit hiding all but a face so pale it seemed translucent. When she spoke, her voice never rose above a whisper. "The Father requests your presence for morning services," she said, eyes fixed on a point just past my shoulder. "You'll observe today. Learn the patterns." The sanctuary looked different in daylight, filtering through stained glass windows depicting scenes I couldn't quite identify. Figures caught in postures between worship and torment. Parishioners filed in silently, each nodding to Sister Helena before taking their seats. I noticed their hands, how each pressed their palm briefly against the pew before sitting, how their fingers traced small patterns in the wood. Later, when the church emptied, I examined those pews and discovered symbols carved into the undersides, each unique and each worn smooth by decades of touching fingers. "Marcus," Sister Helena whispered, appearing beside me so suddenly I nearly fell. "Every soul must know their place." The morning passed in a blur of rituals that almost resembled Catholic tradition, but deviated in subtle, disquieting ways. Father Thaddeus spoke Latin during consecration, but certain phrases jarred my ear. Words inserted that I couldn't translate despite my seminary training. After services, an elderly woman entered the confession booth. "Pioneer woman entered the confession booth. Through a gap in the curtain, I could see Father Thaddeus sitting in the priest's compartment, his profile rigid and attentive. The woman's confession lasted 17 minutes. When she emerged, she looked decades older, her posture stooped, her skin hanging loosely like ill-fitting clothing. She smiled at me as she passed. "He listens," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He always listens." That evening, while organizing hymnals, I found a small leather-bound prayer book wedged between pew cushions. The text inside wasn't printed, but handwritten in burgundy ink that flaked at the edges. When I ran my finger across a page, it came away damp, the ink never fully drying despite the book's apparent age. The prayers inside were unlike any I'd encountered. Desperate, demanding supplications that read more like invocations. One passage caught my eye. "Those who listen stand between words and meaning, between request and fulfillment. The price is measured in time, in essence, in life. But what is years against desire fulfilled?" I slipped the book into my pocket before Father Thaddeus returned to lock the sanctuary for the night. In my quarters, I continued reading until the words began to squirm on the page, rearranging themselves when I looked away. I woke at 3 a.m., the book open on my chest, my nose bleeding freely onto pages now blank, except for a single sentence written in what looked like my own handwriting. "Some books are prayers themselves." My first night watch came after 3 days of orientation. Father Thaddeus handed me a ring of ancient iron keys, their weight disproportionate to their size. "The church remains open until midnight for private devotions," he explained. "You'll patrol hourly, record any prayer requests in the ledger, and remember the rules." The emptiness of the vast church transformed it after dark. Candlelight created moving shadows that stretched and contracted with impossible geometry. The silence pressed against my ears with physical weight, broken only by the occasional creak of wood or whispered prayer from parishioners who slipped in seeking midnight solace. During my third patrol, I noticed sounds behaving strangely. Prayers spoken near the altar echoed from the baptismal font. Whispers from the left transept answered from the right. The church's acoustics seemed to shift, channeling words to destinations that defied architectural logic. Near 11, a final parishioner entered, a young woman with dark hair and eyes that darted nervously around the space. She knelt in the last pew, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles whitened. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "The church closes soon," I said gently. She looked up, tension visible in the cords of her neck. "I need to pray where they can hear me," she whispered. "God hears prayers everywhere." I replied automatically, my seminary training surfacing. A bitter smile twisted her lips. "I'm not talking about God." She introduced herself as Eliza, a local whose grandmother had attended St. Ecclesia Obscura for decades. "She worked here too for a while," Eliza added, her fingers worrying at a small pendant around her neck. Until she didn't. Before I could ask what that meant, the confession booth curtain rustled, drawing my attention. No one had entered. I was certain of it. Yet whispers drifted from within. Urgent, desperate whispers, in a voice that cracked with emotion. "Rule 1. If you hear whispered prayers from the confession booth, but no one is inside, walk away." I stepped back, remembering Father Thaddeus's warning. Eliza watched me, something like recognition dawning in her eyes. "You hear them too," she said. Not a question. The whispers intensified, becoming almost intelligible. My curiosity battled with growing unease as the temperature around the booth dropped sharply. I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. "Don't listen," Eliza warned, standing abruptly. "Don't try to understand." She pressed something into my palm, a small stone pendant matching the one she wore, carved with a symbol I recognized from beneath the pews. "For protection," she whispered, then hurried toward the exit. "I'll come back when it's safer." After she left, I forced myself to complete my rounds, giving the confession booth a wide berth. The whispers faded eventually, but the cold lingered around that area for hours. Just before midnight, while checking doors, I discovered a narrow staircase behind the sacristy that I hadn't noticed before. It spiraled downward, the stone steps worn in their centers from centuries of use. My flashlight beam seemed to penetrate the darkness only a few feet ahead, the light swallowed by the gloom. The stairs ended at a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. One of my keys fit the ancient lock, which turned with a sound like bones breaking. The room beyond contained shelves of leather-bound ledgers, each labeled with a year. They stretched back centuries, far longer than the town had existed according to local history. Curious, I pulled the most recent volume and found page after page of names, dates, and brief descriptions. Thomas Merrick, October 7, healing for daughter. Rebecca Holloway, December 21st, vengeance against neighbor. Each entry was followed by a single word: granted, denied, or most frequently, price. The oldest ledgers were written in languages I couldn't identify, the paper so fragile it threatened to crumble at my touch. In one, I found a crude drawing of the church, but with impossible geometry. Angles that couldn't exist, dimensions that contradicted each other, and beneath it all, a structure that seemed to extend far deeper than the physical building allowed. I was replacing the ledger when I noticed a small box on the bottom shelf, labeled simply caretakers. Inside were personal effects: watches, rings, eyeglasses, and a stack of employment contracts identical to mine, each signed in that same burgundy ink that never quite dried. The most recent belonged to David Chen, dated just 3 months earlier. Searching further, I found a recorder and several tapes labeled with dates. I pressed play on the most recent. Static hissed from the speaker, followed by a man's voice. Presumably David Chen. April 15. I've been recording the prayers from the confession booth when empty. They're becoming clearer. I think I'm starting to understand the pattern in the language. It's not random phonemes, but something structured, something. The recording cut to violent static, then silence, then a whisper so close to the microphone it felt like breath against my ear. "We hear you, David Chen." A chill ran through me as I switched off the recorder. When I looked at my watch, I discovered with a shock that it was nearly 4 a.m. Somehow, I'd lost 4 hours in that archive room. I hurried upstairs to find Father Thaddeus waiting in the sacristy, his expression unreadable. "You've discovered the records," he said. "Not a question. I was just exploring," I stammered. "I'm sorry if—" "Curiosity is natural," he interrupted, "even necessary for your position. Each caretaker must understand what they're tending." He gestured to my hand, where I still clutched one of the tapes. "But I advise against pursuing David's particular interests. His methods were unorthodox." "What happened to him?" I asked. Father Thaddeus's lips curved in that same smile that never touched his eyes. As I said, his prayers were answered. Over the next week, I settled into the rhythm of the church. By day, I assisted with services, maintained the grounds, and recorded the names of those who confessed. By night, I patrolled the ever-shifting corridors, increasingly certain that the church's dimensions changed after dark. I began keeping my own records, noting the strange languages I overheard during services and researching them in my spare time. None matched any known tongue, living or dead. The closest parallels I found were in obscure texts on glossolalia, speaking in tongues, but even those experts would have been baffled by the precise patterns I documented. Rule 2. Some prayers are in languages you will not recognize. Do not try to understand them. Despite this warning, I found myself straining to discern meaning, writing phonetic approximations in a journal I kept hidden beneath my mattress. Certain syllable combinations appeared repeatedly, particularly during confessions, after which parishioners emerged looking physically depleted. The effects on me were subtle at first. Nosebleeds that came without warning. Gaps in my memory ranging from minutes to hours. Vivid dreams in which I stood before the altar reciting words I couldn't understand but somehow knew. I began finding notes in my journal, written in my handwriting that I had no memory of writing. Translations of prayers that made my skin crawl. One morning, I woke to find my sheets soaked with sweat that left rusty stains on the fabric. In the bathroom mirror, I noticed dark circles beneath my eyes and a gauntness to my face that hadn't been there weeks before. When I removed my shirt, I discovered a small mark forming behind my left ear, a symbol matching one I'd seen in the oldest ledger. That same day, while cleaning around the altar, I discovered my name carved into the ancient marble, the lettering fresh among inscriptions weathered by centuries. The carving was precise, deliberate, and located directly above what appeared to be a small drainage channel in the stone. Eliza returned that evening, slipping into the church just before dusk prayers. She brought old photographs of the town, spreading them across a back pew as other parishioners filtered in. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a church groundbreaking ceremony dated 1873. There, standing behind the mayor, was a figure unmistakably Father Thaddeus, appearing exactly as he did now, without a single day's aging in 150 years. "He's in all of them," she continued, showing me photos from every decade. Father Thaddeus at town functions, church renovations, funeral services, his appearance unchanging while those around him aged and died. "What is he?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Eliza's eyes darted toward the sacristy door. "Not what. Who? The question is what he serves." She gathered the photos quickly as Father Thaddeus emerged. "And what it's costing him." Weeks passed, and I noticed patterns among the congregation. Certain parishioners who attended every service, whose features seemed to age subtly each time I saw them. During communion, I observed ritual markings on their palms, pressed against their hearts as they received the host from Father Thaddeus. After one Sunday service, I cornered Eliza in the church garden. "Your grandmother," I said. "You mentioned she worked here." Eliza's eyes clouded. "For 23 years, she was caretaker like you. Her fingers touched the stone pendant around her neck. Then one day, she didn't come home. Father Thaddeus said she'd left town suddenly, but she would never have abandoned me. When was this? 6 years ago? I was 16. Eliza glanced toward the church. I've been watching since then, waiting. 4 caretakers have come and gone in that time, none lasting more than 8 months. A chill spread through me despite the warm day. What do you think happened to them? The same thing that's happening to you. She touched my face gently. You're changing. The church is leaving marks on you. Before I could respond, the church bells began tolling, though it wasn't the hour. Eliza tensed visibly. Special service, she whispered. You should observe, but stay in the shadows. Don't let them see you watching. I followed her advice, positioning myself in the choir loft as parishioners filed in. A select group I recognized as the most devoted attendees, all wearing dark clothing adorned with small silver symbols that caught the light oddly. Father Thaddeus appeared wearing vestments I'd never seen before, ornate with symbols matching those in the ancient ledgers. Sister Helena accompanied him, carrying a silver chalice that emitted thin wisps of vapor despite the warm air. The service resembled no Christian ritual I recognized. The congregants formed a circle around the altar, hands linked, heads bowed. Father Thaddeus spoke in that strange language I'd been documenting, his voice resonating with harmonics that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Sister Helena moved among them with the chalice, each parishioner drinking deeply before resuming their position. As the ritual progressed, I noticed a disturbing transformation. Their features seemed to age before my eyes, skin sagging, hair thinning or graying, vitality visibly draining. Father Thaddeus, by contrast, appeared to grow more vibrant, his movements more fluid, the lines in his face softening slightly. The air in the church grew dense and charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. The candles around the altar flared unnaturally high, then extinguished simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, I heard something moving around the altar, something large that displaced air with a sound like wet silk sliding over stone. The parishioners' whispered prayers intensified, their voices blending into a single droning supplication that made my ears pop with pressure changes. When the lights returned, the altar stone glistened with moisture that slowly drained through the channel I'd noticed earlier. The parishioners filed out silently, each looking decades older than when they had entered. Father Thaddeus watched them go, satisfaction evident in his posture. I retreated to my quarters, shaking uncontrollably. The mark behind my ear burned like a brand, and when I checked it in the mirror, I found it had darkened and expanded, the pattern more complex than before. That night, the church felt different during my patrol, more alert somehow, as if the building itself had awakened. The shadows moved independently of any light source, and the confessional booth seemed to pulse with its own subtle heartbeat. Near midnight, I heard it again, whispers from the empty booth, but clearer now, almost comprehensible. Against my better judgment, against Rule 1, I approached and pressed my ear to the ornate wood. Need to understand, a voice whispered. David Chen's voice from the recordings. They're using us as vessels, as conduits. The prayers are sustenance and barrier both. Michael Hayes needs to. My name in his mouth felt like ice water down my spine. I jerked away, heart pounding, only to find Sister Helena standing directly behind me, her eyes reflecting candlelight like a nocturnal animal's. Rule 3 has been broken, though not by your doing. Rule 3. If you ever hear someone praying for you by name, leave immediately. They are not praying for your salvation. What's happening to me? I demanded, noticing with horror that my voice had adopted the same whispering quality as hers. Sister Helena's expression softened with what might have been pity. You're becoming part of the church, as I did, as Father Thaddeus did in his time. She gestured to the walls around us. This place needs tenders, vessels to channel, and contain what dwells between faith and fulfillment. Those who listen, I said, remembering the passage from the prayer book. She nodded. They've always existed in the spaces between words and meaning. Ancient things that grant what is asked for a price. This church was built to contain them, to channel their power safely. There's nothing safe about what I saw today, I hissed. Those people, they aged years in minutes, a willing sacrifice. Time and vitality exchanged for answered prayers. Her hand moved to her own neck, where I noticed a mark similar to mine. Some of us serve differently. We maintain the barriers, keep those who listen from flowing freely into the world. And the caretakers before me. David Chen, her eyes slid away. Some are consumed entirely. Others become like us. It depends on what they hear, what they understand. She gripped my arm with surprising strength. You've been recording the language, trying to translate. Stop. That path leads to communion, not understanding. Over the following days, my condition deteriorated rapidly. I experienced fugue states lasting hours, coming to awareness in strange parts of the church with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My journal filled with translations I couldn't remember writing. Prayers transcribed in that burgundy ink that stained my fingers, though I owned no such pen. During one such episode, I found myself in the confession booth. Not in the penitent's side, but in the priest's compartment, where Father Thaddeus normally sat. The wooden panel where the congregant would speak was intricately carved with symbols matching those in the ancient ledgers, and beneath the pews. Looking closer, I realized the panel wasn't decorative at all, but functional. A sophisticated acoustic device designed to capture and channel sound. Hidden within the wooden scrollwork was what appeared to be an ancient recording mechanism, far older than any technology should allow, with fine copper wires and crystal components embedded in the wood itself. This booth didn't just hear confessions. It preserved them, channeled them, directed them somewhere beyond the church walls. My discovery was interrupted by a parishioner entering the other side. The elderly woman I'd seen in my first days, now looking frailer than ever. Before I could speak, explain, I wasn't Father Thaddeus. She began her confession. Father, I feel the weight lifting, she whispered. My daughter's cancer is gone, just as you promised. The doctors can't explain it. Her voice broke. How much more will it cost me? Words foamed in my mouth unbidden, in a voice that wasn't entirely mine. Time is the currency of miracles. You have given 3 years for her healing. Do you wish to give more? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Take what you need. She has her whole life ahead of her now. The confession booth grew cold, the air condensing with each breath. Through the screen, I watched in horror as the woman aged visibly, skin wrinkling, hair whitening, spine curving, while energy surged through the wooden panel into my body like electricity. Vitality filled me. The aches and fatigue of recent weeks momentarily vanished. When she left, I stumbled from the booth in panic, only to find Father Thaddeus waiting, his expression knowing. Now you understand, he said. The exchange, the cost, the necessity. You're feeding on them, I accused, my voice shaking. On their lives, not I, he corrected. Those who listen. I merely facilitate the exchange, as caretakers have done for centuries. As you are beginning to do. I never agreed to this. His smile was terrible in its gentleness. Your presence here is agreement enough. The church chose you, Michael, for your lost faith, your emptiness. Perfect vessels are those already hollowed out by doubt. By doubt. That night, during my patrol, the whispers grew deafening. From the confession booth, from behind paintings, from beneath floorboards. And now, among them, I heard my name repeated over and over in supplication. Michael Hayes, hear us. Michael Hayes, answer us. Rule 3, broken beyond repair. But where could I flee when the prayers followed me through every corridor, when they emerged from my own mouth in moments of inattention? I avoided Eliza for days, afraid of what I might be becoming. But she found me eventually, cornering me in the church garden where stone angels watched with expressions of ecstatic agony. "You've seen it now," she said without preamble. "You've seen it now," she said without preamble. The exchange, the cost. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "My grandmother discovered something in the archives," she continued, "about the church's true purpose, not to worship, but to contain." From her pocket, she produced a folded paper, covered with her grandmother's handwriting. She left this hidden for me before she disappeared. The note described a structure far older than the church, a containment vessel for entities that existed in the interstices of faith, beings that fed on devotion and desperation alike. The church was built as both prison and channel, controlling their influence while allowing regulated access to their power. "The caretakers are part of the mechanism," Eliza explained, "living components that maintain the barrier." My grandmother realized she was changing, becoming something not fully human. "Like Sister Helena," I whispered. "Like Father Thaddeus." "Yes." Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "And now you. The mark behind your ear? It's spreading, isn't it?" My hand moved reflexively to the spot, now perpetually hot to the touch. "How did you know?" "They all have it. The vessels, the faithful, different patterns for different purposes." I showed her my journal, the translations I had no memory of writing. Her face paled as she read. "These are summoning prayers," she whispered. "Instructions for bringing those who listen into physical form." She looked up sharply. "Why would they want you to know this?" The realization hit us simultaneously. Not instruction, preparation. My body was being prepared as a vessel, not just for channeling prayers, but for hosting something ancient and terrible. "We need to find the archives again," I said. "There must be more information, some way to stop this." That night, we slipped into the church after my patrol. The staircase behind the sacristy seemed steeper than before, the darkness at its base absolute despite our flashlights. The archive room door stood ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it after my last visit. Inside, we found Father Thaddeus waiting, seated calmly among the ancient ledgers. Sister Helena stood beside him, her eyes reflecting our flashlight beams like a cat's. "Eliza Mercer," Father Thaddeus said, nodding as if greeting an expected guest. "Your grandmother would be disappointed to see you interfering with church matters. Where is she?" Eliza demanded, her voice breaking. "What did you do to her?" "Eric shows a transcendence," Sister Helena whispered, "as all successful caretakers eventually do. She serves still in her way." Father Thaddeus rose, his movements unnaturally fluid. "Michael was chosen specifically," he said, addressing Eliza while gesturing toward me. "Those who listen recognized his potential from the moment he lost faith. Empty vessels carry prayers most efficiently." "I'm not a vessel," I protested, though the burning behind my ear suggested otherwise. "You've been one since you arrived," Father Thaddeus countered. "The question is what you will contain. Something must maintain the barrier, Michael. For centuries, we've kept those who listen controlled, their influence channeled safely through ritual and sacrifice. There's nothing safe about draining years from desperate people," Eliza snapped. "Compared to the alternative?" Father Thaddeus' expression darkened. "Without the church, without vessels like us, they would flow freely into the world, answering any prayer without constraint or cost. Imagine the chaos of desire unleashed, of every desperate wish granted for prices no one understands until too late." As he spoke, the room seemed to expand around us, shadows deepening in impossible ways. The walls pulsed subtly, like the sides of a breathing creature. The barrier weakens, Sister Helena whispered urgently. We need him. The transition must complete. Father Thaddeus nodded. Tonight's service will conclude your preparation, Michael. The final transcendence. You'll take my place as I move to greater service. And if I refuse, his smile was pitying. You already bear their mark. You've heard your name in prayer. There's no refusing, only accepting with understanding or fighting to your destruction. Eliza clutched my arm. There's another way, she hissed. My grandmother's notes, the original structure beneath the church. If it's a prison, it can be sealed completely. Father Thaddeus moved with sudden inhuman speed, seizing Eliza by the throat. Foolish child. Seal it? The consequences would ripple across centuries of prayers, unraveling every miracle, every exchange. His fingers lengthened against her skin, darkening to the color of old blood. Some barriers cannot be rebuilt once broken. I lunged forward, driven by instinct rather than courage. As I touched Father Thaddeus's arm, vision exploded behind my eyes. Centuries of memory, not my own. The weight of endless vigil, of slowly becoming something other than human, while maintaining a crumbling barrier against entities that pressed ceaselessly against the thin membrane of reality. Father Thaddeus released Eliza, staggering back. You see now, he gasped. The necessity, the burden. Eliza recovered quickly, grabbing my hand. Run, she urged. We need to find the original foundation. We fled the archive room. Father Thaddeus's anguished cry echoing behind us. The church had changed again, corridors stretching and twisting unnaturally. Doors appeared where none had been before, light filtering strangely through stained glass that depicted scenes of transformation. Human figures elongating, melding with architectural elements, becoming part of the structure itself. This way, Eliza insisted, pulling me toward the altar. My grandmother's notes mentioned access through the original baptismal font. The nave had transformed as well. The pews now arranged in concentric circles around the altar, which glowed with faint luminescence. The air felt charged, dense with potential energy that made my skin tingle and my teeth ache. The baptismal font, an ancient stone basin I'd previously dismissed as decorative, stood at the edge of the altar platform. Carved into its rim were symbols matching those in my journal and behind my ear. We need to move it, Eliza said, pushing against the heavy stone. Together we strained against its weight. As it finally shifted, revealing a narrow opening beneath, the church responded. A low groan emanated from the walls themselves, and the candles around the altar ignited spontaneously. Father Thaddeus's voice boomed from everywhere at once. Stop! You don't understand what you're unleashing. The opening beneath the font led to a narrow shaft with ancient iron rungs embedded in the stone. Without hesitation, Eliza began descending into the darkness. I followed, the mark behind my ear burning so intensely I expected to smell my own flesh charring. The shaft opened into a circular chamber, far older than the church above. The architecture here was primitive but precise. Massive stone blocks fitted without mortar, their surfaces covered with carvings more ancient than any human language. At the chamber's center stood a pedestal of black stone, atop which rested a crystalline object that defied description, simultaneously transparent and opaque, its geometry shifting as I tried to focus on it. The anchoring point, Eliza whispered, awe and fear mingling in her voice. Where they first crossed over, the crystal pulsed with internal light that synchronized with the burning of my mark. Each pulse sent waves of whispered prayers echoing through the chamber, countless voices begging, demanding, offering sacrifice for intervention. How do we seal it? I asked, my own voice now barely recognizable, layered with harmonics that made the air vibrate. Eliza approached the pedestal cautiously. My grandmother's note said something about blood freely given sealing what blood taken opened. Before she could explain further, the chamber darkened as a figure blocked the shaft above. Father Thaddeus descending with inhuman grace, his limbs elongated and jointed wrongly, his cassock moving as if filled with more than just a human body. "Generations of caretakers have maintained the balance," he said, his voice resonating with multiple tones. "The barrier permits controlled exchange while preventing full manifestation. Break it, and all that has been contained will flow free or be sealed away completely." Eliza countered. "No more feeding on desperate people's lives. Naive child. Those who listen have answered prayer since the first human looked skyward in supplication. This structure doesn't create them. It controls them." He gestured to the crystal. "Remove that, and the church above collapses, physically and metaphysically. Every prayer answered through it unravels." The crystal pulsed brighter, and with each flash, my vision clouded with images. Parishioners receiving miracle cures, finding lost children, escaping disasters, and the cost of each miracle measured in years drained, in vital energy harvested. "He's trying to confuse you," Eliza urged. "We need to act now." Father Thaddeus moved toward the pedestal with frightening speed. I intercepted him, driven by instinct rather than plan. As we collided, his form seemed to ripple, the human disguise slipping to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. A being of angles and surfaces that hurt my mind to perceive. "You were chosen for your emptiness," he hissed, his breath smelling of incense and copper. "A perfect vessel, already hollowed by loss of faith. Accept your purpose." His hands, no longer hands but appendages I couldn't properly comprehend, closed around my throat. The mark behind my ear erupted in searing pain that spread throughout my body. Through tears of agony, I saw Eliza leap onto the pedestal, reaching for the crystal. "Blood freely given," she cried, drawing a small knife across her palm. To seal what blood taken opened, she pressed her bleeding hand against the crystal, which flared with blinding light. Father Thaddeus screamed, a sound containing multitudes, as if countless voices cried out through his mouth. His form contorted impossibly, stretching toward the crystal, even as he maintained his grip on me. The chamber began to shake, dust and stone fragments raining from above. The crystal's light intensified until it was painful to witness, and within it, I glimpsed shapes moving, entities of pure geometry and intention, pressing against a barrier suddenly strengthened. "Eliza!" I called out, breaking free from Father Thaddeus's weakening grip. "We need to get out." She didn't respond, her body rigid with shock, blood flowing freely from her hand into the now molten crystal. I lunged for her, pulling her away as the pedestal began to sink into the floor, the stone blocks around it shifting to close the aperture. Father Thaddeus made one final, desperate attempt to reach the crystal, his form elongating grotesquely. As the gap narrowed, his inhuman appendages were caught in the closing stone, his scream cutting off abruptly as the floor sealed completely. The chamber fell silent, except for our ragged breathing and the distant sound of the church above groaning like a wounded animal. The shaft that had brought us down now represented our only escape from a space rapidly growing unstable. "Can you climb?" I asked Eliza, who stared blankly at her wounded hand. "I saw them," she whispered, "inside the crystal. So many, so hungry." Her eyes refocused on me with effort. "Your mark, it's fading." I touched the spot behind my ear, finding the skin smooth and cool. The constant whispers that had filled my mind for weeks had silenced, leaving a hollow emptiness that was both relief and loss. We climbed the shaft as the chamber collapsed below us, emerging into a church transformed. The ordered beauty had given way to decay, paint peeling, wood rotting, stone crumbling as if centuries of deferred entropy had caught up in moments. The parishioners had fled, leaving behind personal effects that aged to dust before our eyes. Sister Helena alone remained, kneeling before the ruined altar. As we approached, she turned, her face now ancient and withered, the years she'd deferred through service reclaiming her at once. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The prayers. All those answered prayers. They were answered with stolen time, Eliza said firmly, with lives drained away. Sister Helena's expression shifted between despair and relief. For 200 years, I've channeled their voices. Now there's only silence. Tears traced paths through the wrinkles that deepened on her face even as we watched. What happens to those who prayed, whose miracles depended on continuation? I had no answer for her. As dawn light filtered through broken stained glass, Sister Helena crumbled to dust before our eyes. The centuries she deferred claiming her completely. Outside, the town appeared unchanged, the morning proceeding with mundane normalcy. People walked dogs, collected newspapers, departed for work, all oblivious to the metaphysical cataclysm that had occurred overnight. The church stood, as it always had, but now visibly abandoned, its stones weathered, its grounds overgrown as if it had been derelict for decades. No one will remember, Eliza said, understanding dawning in her eyes. Reality has adjusted around the seal. I nodded, feeling both hollow and strangely free. Your grandmother is at peace now, she finished, along with all the others. 3 months passed. I found work as a groundskeeper at a small church in a neighboring town. Mundane work maintaining gardens and fixing plumbing. The church itself was unremarkable, its services conventional, its congregation ordinary in their devotions. The dreams began gradually, whispers at the edge of consciousness, prayers filtering through from somewhere beyond sleep. I dismissed them as trauma echoes, psychological aftermath of my experience at St. Ecclesia Obscura, until I noticed the stone baptismal font in the church's side chapel, identical to the one that had concealed the entrance to the chamber beneath St. Ecclesia, and the small symbols carved beneath the pews, worn smooth by generations of touching fingers. And finally the mark returning behind my ear, faint but unmistakable. I called Eliza immediately. It's happening again, I told her without preamble. Different church, same entities. Her voice sounded distant, resigned. They were never just in that building, Michael. The church was a focal point, not their only access to our world. Then what did we accomplish? I demanded. We closed one door, but prayers create their own openings. I heard shuffling papers on her end. My grandmother's notes mentioned other structures, other focal points across the country, places where the barrier is maintained through different means. That night, I discovered a new caretaker had been hired. A young woman with haunted eyes and a story of lost faith following personal tragedy. As I showed her around the grounds, the parish priest approached with a yellowed piece of parchment in hand. The rules for night attendance, he explained, his smile never reaching his eyes. Critical for your duties. I caught a glimpse of the familiar text. 3 rules, written in meticulous calligraphy with ink that looked suspiciously brown rather than black. I'll handle her orientation, I said quickly, intercepting the parchment. Later, in the garden where stone angels watched with expressions between ecstasy and agony, I showed the new caretaker the mark behind my ear. You have a choice, I told her. One I wasn't given. The barrier between worlds must be maintained, but the cost need not be unwitting sacrifice. I explained everything, the entities that exist between words and meaning, the prayers that feed them, the vessels that channel them, how I had become a living lock on a door that constantly seeks to open. Those who listen exist where intention meets articulation, I explained. They cannot be destroyed or banished permanently, but they can be contained through conscious choice rather than manipulation. I offered her the same 3 rules, but with new meaning. If you hear whispered prayers from the confession booth when no one is inside, acknowledge them silently. Recognition without engagement maintains boundaries. Some prayers are in languages you will not recognize. Do not try to understand them. Meaning creates connection. Connection creates vulnerability. If you ever hear someone praying for you by name, respond immediately with your own prayer. They are not praying for your salvation, but neither must you become what I nearly did. She considered this, fear and fascination warring in her expression. Why tell me the truth when others kept you in ignorance? Because willing vessels are stronger than those taken through deception, I said, the knowledge emerging from somewhere beyond my conscious mind. I maintain the barrier now, but differently than Father Thaddeus did, with awareness rather than submission. At night I still hear the whispers, prayers filtering through the thin membrane between worlds. I feel the weight of what presses against reality's edge, hungry for manifestation, for the power to answer and transform. But I am no longer hollowed out by loss of faith. Instead, I am filled with purpose, not to serve those who listen, but to ensure they hear only what we choose to voice. Every prayer has power. Every word creates ripples in reality. Choose carefully what you pray for, and to whom, or what, you direct your supplication. And if you ever find yourself in a church where the shadows move against the light, where the confessional whispers when empty, where you feel eyes upon you during moments of deepest prayer, remember the rules. Some prayers are not meant to be heard, but sometimes they are heard anyway.